Hello and welcome to Fantastic Fights, the podcast about a middle-aged man playing adventure game books out loud on the internet. That middle-aged man is me, Hieronymus J. Doom, and this is another bonus episode made possible by my patrons over at patreon.com/HJDoom. I have to thank another patron who has increased their pledge this week. Jim, thanks so much for your generous support. It helps keep the lights on with this podcast. It also funds my second podcast where I'm currently watching terrible movies and talking about them at length until my brain melts. All patrons get access to a bevy of adventure game books written by members of the Doom household, and I'm currently in the midst of writing a new game book with a retro science fiction theme. This episode we're looking at What Lies Beneath the Clock Tower by Margaret Killjoy with illustrations by Juan Navarro. It describes the book as being an adventure of your own choosing, which is a neat way of sidling up to the words choose your own adventure without impinging on the copyright of everyone's favourite highly litigious publisher of children's game books. The cover shows a louche gentleman in a top hat smoking a cigarette, surrounded by some short, ugly humanoid critters that have a strong goblin vibe to them. It's nice in a cartoony sort of way. It reminds me a little of the work of Chris Riddell, but it's a bit more scratchy. Margaret Killjoy is a fairly prolific author, but this is her only game book as far as I can tell. She's also a musician and a podcaster who does an anarchist survivalist podcast and a rather nice podcast that showcases cool people from history who made the world a better place. I wanted to feature her work because anarchist steampunk game book written by trans black metal musician is basically catnip to someone like me. Also, being an old school choose your own adventure style game book, there's no rules to look at, so we can just dive straight into the playthrough, which we'll do right now as we play What Lies Beneath the Clock Tower. The book begins with a couple of quotes. Firstly, never again will a single story be told as though it's the only one, which is by John Berger. And there can never be a single story, there are only ways of seeing, by Arundhati Roy. Introduction. Goodly reader, in this story you will take the role of Gregory, a curious and youthful gentleman of British birth living in an ambiguous city in 19th century France. And while this story is indeed adventurous, lest its very subtitle be criminally misleading, you must bear in mind that you, Gregory, are more acquainted with absinthe and vice than firearms and acrobatics. I mean, she's got my number. Aside from the fact I'm not called Gregory, that does sound a lot like me. Also, I guess, I don't live in an ambiguous city in 19th century France. I live in an ambiguous town in 21st century England. Also, I'm not youthful or a gentleman. But aside from that, she's got me banged to rights. You will not venture forth with empty hands or pockets. We shall not allow you to be so unprepared. At the beginning of this tale, you are wearing a fashionable, if cheap, suit, complete with a black wool overcoat and starched felt bowler. You have a pocket watch on a chain, but this is no ordinary pocket watch. This pocket watch has been overwound and is in need of repair. Your wallet is empty of money. They seem to have taken it all at the bar. In one hand you bear a simple bronze head cane of stained wood, borne as an affectation. In your trouser pockets you have a silver ring that you won in a game of chance. A ring that you are hoping to give to your lover. And of course, you would not consider leaving your chamber without an ample supply of intoxicants, which may be found in various flasks and bottles upon your person. It is with these provisions that you begin your absinthe-muddled journey into the depths of the Undercity. This book, as you may have conjectured, does not read like a normal book. This book is not constrained by the limits of linear form. You will be allowed to make choices. Each section is numbered. At the end of each section you will be told which section to read next or be given a choice. Each choice will be presented as a section number in bold. Drunk on the green fairy you may be. We hope that this does not overtax you. I have actually drunk absinthe on a few occasions, and the very first occasion I drank absinthe, I danced extremely badly for about an hour, announced that I didn't feel at all drunk, stepped outside for some fresh air, and was sick on my own shoes. I did bizarrely then drink it again on a couple of separate occasions. I quite like it. It's a bit over the top. Like, you know where you are with cheap cider or cheap whiskey. It's doing the same job that the absinthe is. It just doesn't have any airs and graces about it. It's not pretending that the act of becoming inebriated is some sort of artistic endeavour. I won't lie to you, some of the choices may very well lead to your death, or to fates still worse. The honest thing to do, of course, when you reach such an end would be to admit defeat. However, it is important to remember that this is just a book. There will be no one to scold you if you backtrack through time to make a new, hopefully wiser decision. And that's nice. I'm a big fan of letting people know ahead of time that honestly, cheating is absolutely fine. So let us begin proper. The clock tower above your apartment tolls, ringing twice. You sit in your bedroom, which serves as your salon, which serves as your dining room and kitchen, which serves, quite unfortunately, as your water closet. The rain is pooling on the floor by the leaky window, and the wind is rushing through the alley outside with such force that your meagre curtains billow and sway. The green-tinted bottle lies empty at your tired feet, but you are not prepared to sleep. There are letters unanswered, and what sort of gentleman would you be if you delayed in your correspondence? After the tolling of the bells, you hear a most curious sound, a sound quite unfamiliar to you. It is the sound of an iron gate, perhaps scraping and squealing from disuse. Or it is the sound of a dozen dogs of hell scratching their claws of steel on the stone of their prison, howling towards the setting moon. But one thing is certain of the noise: it came from the stairwell right outside your door. So I like the fact that we've declared a tone early, and we seem to be sticking to it quite nicely. It's slightly arch, not taking itself at all seriously. I think tone can be a great way of differentiating your gamebook. Some of the entries in the Lindenbaum prize were mechanically very similar, but differentiated themselves wonderfully with a tone that was either light-hearted or serious or surreal. So yeah, nice to see a proper tone being struck. So we've got a choice. We can refuse to investigate, passing it off as the fancy of a tired mind, or we can rise, don coat, hat and cane, and step out of your parlour to see what is the trouble. Tempting though it is to refuse the call to adventure, I am going to step out of the parlour and see what the trouble is. The lamp seems to be out and the stairwell is dark, but for the orange glow that seeps in from the streetlights outside. You pause, letting your eyes adjust to the darkness, and close your door quietly behind you, locking it. At the base of the steps, a floor below you, lies a dark bundle. To your mind, it may be a rucksack, or a child, an imp, or a pile of laundry. It does not move. Coming from the belfry upstairs, you hear the unmistakable sound of conflict, heavy breathing and boots clacking on the hardwood. Or perhaps it is the dancing of cloven-hooved demons. So we can either investigate the belfry or inspect the bundle. Well, the belfry sounds sinister and a little intimidating, so we may give that a miss. I would say I would love to live in a house with a belfry. But yes, I think we'll investigate the bundle at the base of the steps. You creep down the steps, one hand on the banister, the other on your cane. When you reach the ground floor, you realise that the stone staircase has a quite unnatural door set into it that you don't for the life of you remember. One that gapes darkness and seems sized but for a child. And on closer inspection, you realise that the bundle on the floor is not a bundle at all, but is instead a miniature green man, one with long, floppy ears and tufts of white hair protruding at all angles from his wrinkled scalp. You stare, presuming the prone figure to be asleep or unconscious, until you realise that he stares right back at you, his eyelids open a slit to reveal dark eyes. "Come no closer, gnome," you say, holding your cane before you as though it alone would hold back demons from the nethers. But as soon as he hears your words, the creature springs forward, lunges towards you, and crawls between your legs to cower behind you. "Where?" he asks in a frightened voice. "Where are the gnomes? I cannot see them." Something in his demeanour, perhaps it is his obvious fear that outweighs even your own, puts you at ease and you shake your legs free of him. I thought you were a gnome." "Of course not. I take offence at such comments." "And you are?" you question the man whose eyes meet your kneecaps. "Agog," he replies, walking slowly up a few steps before turning and facing you at belt level. I feel as though I should probably be doing a squeaky voice for this goblin, but at the same time that would get very wearing very quickly for listeners, so I'm going to stick with just straightforwardly northern. "Fascinating," you reply, because you've never before met such a lucid creature while dreaming. "I've never even heard of a gog. Where do gogs come from?" The olive-green fellow jumps up and stamps his feet on the step. "My name is Agog. Agog the Goblin. I am a goblin, and like any goblin from the Undercity, the gnomes are my sworn enemies." A wistful look finds its way into Agog's eye, and he begins to head off at a tangent. Well, not that the gnomes know we are their sworn enemies. They just think we work for them. Now, a few generations back, in my grand goblin's time. You stare at him, curious, but he seems to have lost his train of thought. "Well then, Agog, my name is Gregory, and I'm the caretaker of this tower." The last bit isn't the sort of truth you'd really want to call truth per se. "I admit I'm quite curious about what you're doing here, where this door came from, and what that racket above our heads is all about." "And right you would be to be curious. There's great work afoot, great work indeed." Agog comes down from his perch and circles you 6 times clockwise, then 6 times counterclockwise. "I've spelled you good. You're now obliged to take hand in our rescue." Am I really?" you ask, because you're not certain you believe him. "Yes, of course. It's one of them geese curse magic spells that you humans believe in. It's where I trick you into thinking that if you don't come and do some task, what probably with some kind of shiny reward, you'll turn into a goose and be eaten by your fellows. So then, in the name of the underworld, us goblins need your help." "And if I don't help?" "Well then, my magic curse will turn you into a goose in 3 days' time. That's what'll happen to you." "Will it really?" "No." You sit down on the stones and pull a flask from your hatband. Sipping on spirits usually does you a bit of good in these sorts of situations. Well, you've never been in quite this sort of situation, but it turns out that the gin does indeed help. Because gin always helps. Although a gin hangover is a truly terrible thing. And I'm not sure I'd want to drink neat gin. But a gin and tonic, that's a pleasant drink on a warm day. "Spare a swallow of that for an old goblin?" Agog asks, and you pass him the flask. It's been a while since we last had any kind of choice. This is nicely written, but it seems to be more of a book, perhaps, than an adventure game book. Which is fine. It's a perfectly valid way of writing adventure game books. But I feel as though these longer sections could be a little bit of a drag on a reread. "So, well, maybe you're not cursed, or geesed, or liable to get goosed, but see, I'll lay it out plain as a planet. We goblins got it bad, real bad. Us and the kabouters, big blind fellows with pasty white skin and a screech like a bat, you'd like 'em. We ain't been treated like we deserve to be treated. The gnomes have us at light rifle point, they do. I'd rather be dead, I figure. We've got plans, real good ones and real big ones, to be free. I can't say as I know you enough to trust you with the real workings going on above our heads, though. But we're building stuff that'll help. Weapons, let's say. And I thought I'd come with, but of course I decided to take a nap down here since I was getting sort of tired, and now they've all gone ahead and started without me, and I don't really have a role in this no more. I'm going to the back through that doorway into a world of dark violence, death, and steam-powered contraptions. You can either come with me, be a hero, or at least another fellow with a good-sized stick, or you can go back into your little room up there and do whatever it is you were doing with your life, and I promise you'll never have another chance to see a world aside from your own. The goblin burps, then giggles, yellow sharp teeth protruding from black gums. The laughter sets him off hiccuping, and eventually he falls over on his side in chuckles. So we've got another chance to refuse the call to adventure by returning to the room and our unfinished letters, but we are going to join the goblin on the adventure. Like a good improv group, let's say yes and. Right then, geese or no geese, I'll follow you into the dark nethers. I have just one question for you first. What's that? Agog asks, calming down from his laughter but still hiccuping. Am I hallucinating this? No, don't figure you are. But you're so short and green and, well, you search for the right word. Hallucinatory? That'll do. Well, I suppose I think I've been around for decades now, being rather an old goblin, but if I was a product of your imagination, would I know it? I don't know. Well, I'm glad that's settled, Agog says, as if anything were settled. He leads you into the doorway and down a steep flight of rather obnoxiously short and tightly packed stairs. Of course you can't see a thing, but years of stumbling home blind drunk have taught you a thing or two about feeling your way across treacherous terrain without the use of your eyes. In fact, you only stumble forward into your guide once during the course of the whole 15-minute descent. Eventually you find yourself in a reasonably well-lit service tunnel that, while tall enough to accommodate you, is packed with tubes, pipes and apparatus. Which way? You ask because Agog has stopped. Heavens if I know, he says. I guess it depends on what you want to do. And you had presumed that he had some sort of plan for you. Well, I think you've got three options. There's us goblins, and we mostly live over that way in Haddlelint. We're like slaves, and we mine stuff. We also engineer and invent and do all sorts of things that gnomes don't think we know how to do. But mostly, we just mine. We're staging an attack too. Then you've got the kabouters over in Underberg. Now that's not what they call it, but it's what we like to call it. The kabouters, they're like, I don't know what you'd call them up there, but, you know, what do you call a snotty fellow who lives outside the city in a fancy little town and has a bit more money than the factory workers, but still doesn't have any say in how anything works? Sod? You offer. Yeah, that's them. Most of them don't even know they're slaves. You could go there, talk some sense into them. You'd at least get to eat better. Either way would help us, I suppose, but both ways you're liable to end up killed. You said you thought I had three options. Oh, right. Well, you could just walk right up to the gnomes in Hakal, their metropolis, but you don't want to do that. Forget I brought it up. So we can express interest in Haddlelint and the goblins, we can ask to be taken to Underberg and speak with the kabouters, or we can insist that we are shown the way to Hakal to see the gnomes first hand. Well, I think that we will go to the Underberg and speak with the kabouters because they seem intriguing to me. Sort of small-holding farmer types. They eat well in the suburbs, you ask. Better than a goblin, that's certain, Agog replies. Right then, it's settled. To Underberg. I know a thing or two about getting a rise out of folks who think they're all proper and happy. Do you always think with your stomach? There seems to be genuine appreciation in Agog's voice. No, you say. Before I've had anything to drink, I think with my... What's the organ that makes you want booze? Brain. Right, well, before I'm drunk, I think with my brain. Agog giggles and bounces up and down in the tunnel, his long green ears are flapping. And it occurs to you that you haven't been thinking with your stomach or your brain. It takes you a moment, but you decide you've been thinking with your heart. But that sounds terribly cliché and certainly won't make it into your poetry come the morning. Instead, you decide you have been thinking with your wormwood. Wormwood, the ingredient of absinthe that allegedly makes you go mad, which is, what everyone wants from a beverage. Agog takes your hand and breaks into a sprint, moving significantly faster than you would expect a little green monster who can barely meet eyes with your kneecaps to go, and you are forced into a swift jog to keep pace. You fly down the tunnels for 20 minutes and stop in front of a vent that Agog immediately begins to disassemble. So, what's your plan? Give a good rousing speech? You Brits are good for speeches, is what I hear. I can interpret too. No, you say. Speeches are good for riling people up with nothing to lose, people who maybe were thinking about giving it a go but just never really made up their minds. What then? We're going to destroy their way of life, you say. In the dimly lit hallway, you don't know if Agog can see your manic grin. You've never had much love for the middle class. At least the upper class know how to party. The middle class, worse than useless. Huh, Agog says. The vent comes off the wall, revealing a crawl space. Well, a walk space for Agog, a crawl space for you. How are you going to do that, then? I don't know yet. What's the situation like in Underberg? You get on your hands and knees and crawl into the wind. It's quite painstaking and, after the first bend in the tunnel, dark. Agog leads the way and you follow his voice while he apprises you. It's pitch black, isn't it? Like I was saying before, the kabouters don't see with their eyes, they see with their ears. They screech. It's a bit unnerving, just to warn you, and know where everything is. Blind as a bat, you suggest? Bats can see with their eyes. No, they're blind as a cave critter, only without the weird feeler thingies. They're kind of ugly like one, too. Anyhow, Underberg, the gnomes don't bother to guard Underberg. The stupid kabouters have been slaves so long that they don't know that they're slaves. Yup, sounds like the middle class to me. What are their houses made of? Snot. They excrete a kind of sticky paste through their noses. It's good glue, but if you have time and enough kabouters, you can build yourself a hive. Is it flammable? Sure. You've a lighter? You ask. Of course. Why? You've some opium? No, I just think I have a plan. Good, we're nearly there. So we've got a choice. We can set about incinerating the town of Underberg in the hope that the chaos that ensues will spark the revolutionary potential and desire of the kabouters. That's an option. Or we can go into the city first and develop some sort of stunning and only metaphorically incendiary plan. Well, I do love setting fire to things. And inculcating revolutionary zeal requires people to be angry, and setting fire to people's stuff will make them angry. I just am not entirely convinced that it'll make them angry in a way that leads to them throwing off the shackles of gnome slavery, and instead might lead to demands that the gnomes do something about all the arson. So I think we'll go to the city first and develop some sort of only metaphorically incendiary plan. Agog passes you his lighter and you strike it, witnessing a bizarre scene. A hatch in the floor opens onto a rope ladder and darkness. A green little man, Agog, stands poised to descend, and right behind him stands perhaps the strangest looking creature you've ever seen. See, I'd have said little green man. I've heard it suggested that the order of modifiers in English is remarkably invariant. that size almost always comes before colour. Yeah, I just checked, and usually the order is you go quantity, quality or opinion, size, age, shape, colour, proper adjective, i.e. nationality, other place of origin or material, and finally purpose or qualifier. It's a small thing, but it does tend to read as odd if you put the modifiers in a different order. Anyway, the creature is taller than the goblin and shorter than you, but it's hard to discern his height in the dim light and the strange, cramped corridor. His skin is paler than that of a sickly white fellow. His eyes are enormous, unseeing orbs. His ears are deranged, maybe like an elephant's. And he's hyperventilating, you think, only, silently. Hello, you ask. Good morrow. Are you here with the above ground? The stranger speaks with excellent English, although you detect a hint of a Russian accent. Yes, you say, thinking that he means the surface of the earth. Hell no, Agog corrects. What? The kabouter, what else could it be, asks. We're not with those wimpy city gnomes. Oh, you say, is that like how up above we have, the underground? Is that the resistance movement that is largely incompetent and people mostly join just so that they can be impressed with themselves? Well, you think, I've never heard it put quite that way before, but yes. Then yes, the above ground is like your underground, only the underground is above ground and the above ground is underground, of course. Of course, you say. This calls for a drink and the flask in your boot happily obliges. You pass it to your two companions who both drink deeply. So if you're not with the above ground, are you working with the gnomes? You'll have your ears, you snotty bastard. Agog reaches up to grab the stranger. You try and hold him back, but no sooner is your hand on his shoulders than you get kicked something vicious in the chest. Sorry, the kabouter says. I offer you sincere apology, my good goblin. Believe me, I would not have thought you to be a... You'd better not have had. Agog grumps. Look, I'm quite confused, you say, so I'll just lay it all out. My handsome, forgiving, and very much not a traitor friend Agog and I were on our way to Underberg to see what kind of trouble we could stir up, see if we couldn't recruit some of you capable folks for a full-scale revolution. And how did you think to do that? So we can suggest minor shenanigans that are likely to draw the ire of the gnomish guards and therefore spark anti-colonial sentiment within the kabouters, or propose that we gather up all who will listen and persuade them with your charisma and oratory prowess. The only way to foment revolution is to realistically force the state into the use of violence against its own citizens, something which it will almost certainly be doing already. But you need to direct, I believe, the attention of potential revolutionaries towards their actual enemy, and I think minor shenanigans, a campaign of civil disobedience of some sort, is likely to lead to a crackdown by the gnomes, because I assume violence is the only language they understand, so we will go with that. So you kabouters are slaves when it comes down to it? Of course, the kabouter says. But they treat you well enough most of the time? Indeed, as long as we don't cause too much trouble, we don't really know we're slaves. Exactly, you say. Exactly what? The kabouter asks. In order to free the kabouters, we need to bring down the wrath of the gnomes upon them. What you are saying is the opposite of sense. Perhaps you've had too much drink? I can smell it on your breath. No, you have to understand, my good... Say, I didn't catch your name. Sergei, the kabouter says, Russian indeed. And you? Gregory, you'll have to trust me about this. It'll work. Why would I trust you? I've just met you. Sergei says. You can trust him, Agog says, because he thinks he's hallucinating all of this. None of you make sense, Sergei says. Look, let's just go build some barricades, throw some rocks at gnomes, you'll see. Well, I do like to throw rocks at gnomes, Sergei concedes. It's settled, you say, as though anything was settled. You pass the lighter to Agog and begin to descend the ladder. Soon Agog snuffs the flame and you climb down into a darkness filled with a silence punctuated by horrendous screeching. You count some 200 rungs before a screech closer than the others shatters your nerve. You lose count and almost your grip, but then realise that it came from Sergei above and not actually from a giant human-eating bat swooping ever nearer to you in the dark. Unless, of course, there's more to kabouters than you're currently being told. You find the floor and set your feet down, quite excited to be on solid ground, until you remember that you're leagues beneath the surface of the earth. At the last minute you step out of the way, realising others are coming down in the dark. Let's cause some ruckus, Agog says as he joins you. Right then, Sergei, which way to the tunnel to the gnomish city? We call them hallways, and the city you speak of is called Hakal. He expels a good bit of phlegm with this last word. Something in your throat? That is the city's name, Hakal. It's where the gnomes live, and the hall is this way. Follow me, he says, and his voice trails off in the darkness. He leads you by talking constantly, and you learn about how the gnomes and the kabouters came to these caverns from elsewhere hundreds of years ago, displacing the goblins into the lower depths where the mushrooms don't grow as abundantly. You learn about how the goblins make an attempt to free themselves once a generation, and that the gnomes are currently on guard for the next attempt. They're far enough from the rest of the Underberg that you can probably use that lighter to see, Sergei says. Actually, here. Something is thrust into your hands that feels like a wet stick. The lighter flares and you realise you're holding a stick that looks as though it's made of brittle wax. This is snot, isn't it? You ask as Agog sets the torch alight. Yup, Agog says. You're standing in a natural cavern, certainly the largest and most fantastic that you've ever seen. Everything glitters and strange formations drip down the walls and dangle from the ceiling. The floor, however, has been levelled. At the edge of your torchlight, you see the beginnings of a city that looks like it was made by mad, gigantic bees. It's clearly more a hive than it is a distinct series of buildings, but it's a hive made of the same waxy snot as your torch. In the other direction there's a hallway. It looks a bit like a service hallway you would find under a modern building with steam pipes and all. Well, let's do some damage, you say. You start grabbing rubble from the caverns and piling it, and Sergei starts cementing it together with snot. Agog, in the meantime, has pulled a monkey wrench out from somewhere and is going at the pipes with single-minded determination. It doesn't take long before you have a goblin-high wall across the corridor and the pipes and cables have been tangled into confusion. Nor does it take long for the guards to arrive. Dose the light, Sergei whispers. I hear 3 gnomes coming. You go to smother it against the rock wall, but you've forgotten that the mortar itself is combustible, and soon you stand before a burning barricade. Now you can hear the gnomes running towards you. The 3 of you gather up rocks and throw them through the flames, laughing with revolutionary joy when you hear one conk off of metal that you take to be a guard's helmet. The flames are so high and thick that you cannot see, but at least the gnomes will not see you either. After several minutes of tossing rocks, you retreat. I am sort of aware that this is very much an English gentleman as imagined by an American. Just few little tells here and there that let me know that this is not someone who speaks British English as a first language. It's pretty good though, I will say. The telltales are quite small, which makes a nice change. The flames are so high and thick that you cannot see, but at least the gnomes will not see you either. After several minutes of tossing rocks, you retreat. This way, Sergei says, and grabs you by the arm. You pick up Agog and carry him as though he were a toddler and run into the dark city ahead. You're led through a screeching crowd and are told to crawl into a small corridor. Thank you, my friends, you say to your companions, your heart full of adrenaline, finer perhaps than any drug. A sip of brandy to calm the nerves? Agog asks, uncorking a bottle and placing it in your hands. No thanks, you say, surprising yourself. You've no desire to dull the fervour you feel. What now? Sergei asks. A fine question. Well, we won't find out what happens next because I think that is a sensible point to pause the recording. Seems to be going very well. I'm enjoying it. It's nice to read something that is quite openly anarchist propaganda. Although I read a lot of leftist non-fiction, I don't read a great deal of leftist fiction because my tastes in fiction are tediously right-wing in many ways. I'm a big Robert E. Howard guy, I'm a big Lovecraft guy, I'm a big fan of hard-boiled pulp crime fiction. I don't have a massively left-wing taste in art. I do like Michael Moorcock, very left-wing, Hawkwind, very left-wing, but it is a nice thing to read something that's coming from a very different political place than most of the fantasy literature that we've covered on the podcast. One of the things that I've occasionally complained about in Fighting Fantasy books is the way in which they all assume that monarchy is fine and everyone in the society is completely on board with it, whereas actually the reality of history is a lot more complex than that. Anyway, I'm going to go away. I'm going to read this book, What Lies Beneath the Clock Tower, on my own time, and I'll be back for you in just a few moments with some closing remarks. Tatty bye. I have finished What Lies Beneath the Clock Tower, and overall I enjoyed it. To a certain extent it grew on me as I delved more deeply into it. I think the best things about it only become more apparent as you explore more of the different narratives available. In terms of overall structure, this is like a classic choose-your-own-adventure book, in the sense that there's many branching narratives to choose from, but these narratives are noticeably longer here than in a classic choose-your-own-adventure book. It's partly that this is more expansively written, sections are considerably longer after all, but it's also because a lot of the endings are end-loaded, so to speak. You won't generally find yourself suddenly ending the story after only a couple of choices, unless you really want to refuse the call to adventure. The longer narratives make most of the different adventures feel more satisfying, but that does tend to make backtracking to find different outcomes a little bit more onerous. It would probably be fine with a physical book, but with the ebook I was using, it did feel like a chore at times. There's a fair amount of variety to the adventures you can have as well. You can separate them into two main branches based on whether you go down into the depths with Agog the Goblin, as we did, or go to explore the Belfry instead. Going down into the depths lets you explore the Goblin town and the Kabuta town, as well as going off to get into some scrapes at the gnomes' capital. Go into the Belfry and you get a chance to contribute to the revolution either above or below ground in a fashion that's either peripheral or as central as grabbing a rifle and joining the revolutionary goblin army. There's also a chance to visit the Gnome City in that version and see things a little from their perspective as a spy, and that's one of the most satisfying narratives in the gamebook for me. One thing I like very much is how focused each and every narrative is on the core premise of a struggle between goblin and gnome that's about to kick off in a very serious manner. This doesn't have the thing that some choose-your-own-adventure books have, where they sort of forget about the premise of the book for big chunks of the story. This is all about the revolution, but there's enough different approaches and different endings to prevent it feeling especially repetitive. In terms of endings, this is actually very interesting. I said at the start that this book has a didactic quality to it. It's written on the basis that anarchism is good and hierarchies are bad. Some of the endings you find early on feel as though they're laying it on a bit thick. Choosing to side with the oppressors at any point is punished with an instant death, usually a messy one. Now, I've no problem playing anarchist propaganda, but I want it to be good anarchist propaganda, and at the start of my time with this book, some of it seemed a little bit crude. Thankfully, this turned out to be something of an illusion, because as you get deeper into the book, the endings become a lot more interesting. For example, there's a lot of things later on that cast doubt on the simplistic idea that because the gnomes are bad, and they are, the goblins are intrinsically good. There's some very interesting work exploring the use of violence as a tool for social change in this book as well. Many of the goblins you meet are very happy to use violence, and some of them seem a little bit too happy to use violence against targets who might not usually be seen as combatants in a war. The text doesn't explicitly say whether this can be justified or not, but it deliberately plays with the boundaries between armed struggle and terrorism. You can attempt to forestall or circumvent the use of violence as well, with results that vary from the ambiguous to the catastrophic. One of the criticisms that's often levelled against anarchists is that anarchists have a fundamentally utopian vision of human nature. That is to say that if the apparatus of the state and oppressive hierarchies are removed, humanity's essential goodness is all that's required for people to live in harmony. And that's not actually always the case. A lot of anarchists, myself included, do not necessarily believe in the fundamental goodness of human nature. And indeed, it's precisely because that human nature is fundamentally corrupt that hierarchies need to be removed. You only have to look at how holders of power deploy violence against their own citizens to maybe come to the conclusion that this isn't something we should be allowing or encouraging. So it's fascinating to me to see work derived from an anarchist perspective that is exploring this notion that just because you're opposing hierarchy doesn't mean you're necessarily a good person. As well as the morality of violence, there's also some time spent exploring the consequences of violence. Again, there's the impression early doors that this is a relatively simplistic story about the heroism of armed struggle against an oppressor. Again, the reality is a little more complex than that. There are more failed revolutions than successful ones, and in this gamebook, even the successful ones have a way of dwelling on the body count involved. If violence is depicted as an answer to the problem of structural inequality, it's not depicted as an easy answer. And in this, it makes a stark contrast with something like Heinlein's Starship Troopers, where violence is depicted as the central tool of human civilization, and the practitioners of violence are valorized as exemplars of what it means to be human. I think this reflects an understanding of history which is littered with failed revolutionaries, from Spartacus to the Spanish Civil War and indeed beyond. Most attempts to dismantle the status quo lead to piles of bodies, and piles of bodies should be a tragedy regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum. Indeed, one of the big problems with the political spectrum is that for certain chunks of it, they don't really have a problem with piles and piles of bodies. As well as various flavours of military disaster and the odd act of sabotage that ends in mass murder, there's also plenty of opportunities for your character to drift out of the action one way or another. You can end up leaving the story like the children in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe leaving Narnia and being unable to return to the strange world of goblins, gnomes and kabouters. The large proportion of negative or highly ambiguous endings made me fairly determined to try and find what I thought was the best ending I could, and that helped me push on through the book. It made it feel a little bit more like a game book than a choose your own adventure, and I enjoyed hunting for that elusive, really good outcome a great deal, and I won't spoiler as to whether I actually found one. There's some nice digressions along the way as well. I appreciate the opportunity to romance either a male or female goblin, which sounds a bit weird now I say it out loud. There's probably something a bit odd about romancing a 3-foot-tall avocado-coloured troglodyte, but the depiction is quite chaste in a 19th century way, so at least we're spared the question of anatomical compatibility. Another sentence that sounds much weirder out loud than it did when I wrote it in my notes. You can wind up on a different track, which nevertheless feels like it makes sense in the context of the story, especially losing your opportunity to contribute to one revolution and maybe opting to find a different revolution to contribute to. A lot of this is really good, but I do have some reservations about the book. I would describe it as tolerably well written, though not without flaws. Firstly, I think I would have preferred the protagonist to be more of a blank slate than he is. While you can do tremendous things in a gamebook that is striving to evoke a particular atmosphere, such as being an assassin or a superhero or whatnot, I think those things land best when they are expressed through the choices that you make, rather than being passively told things about your character. Being told that you're a louche Victorian drunk is just less fun than being told you're a Victorian and then encouraged to be a louche drunk by the choices that you're offered. I think you can get away with being a bit more deterministic if you're using a well-known character such as He-Man or Mr. Blobby. And I feel like perhaps the hero of What Lies Beneath the Clock Tower should have been a prominent anarchist like Mikhail Bakunin, or indeed Mr. Blobby. Have I just talked myself into writing a Mr. Blobby gamebook? Perhaps I have. This is a book that might have benefited from being structured and presented more like a gamebook in the fighting fantasy tradition. There's enough of a clear overarching goal that a few more game elements could have slotted in quite nicely. You could have operationalised the boozing quite easily by penalising the player for sobering up, for example. I felt a strong pull to get to the best ending, and I think framing the narrative as more of a quest than the more open-ended choose-your-own-adventure structure could have elevated this a little. But I also get the urge to try and keep your writing to a form that's going to be familiar. Another element that I'm a little ambivalent about is the overall tone of the prose. It's got a light and humorous tone for the most part, which works well as a foil for some of the grimmer elements of the story. It makes the serious stuff feel like it's coming out of nowhere, which I genuinely like. But I did find the tone a little self-consciously goofy at times. It's something that wound me up in a recent Choose Your Own Adventure we covered last month about the ant people. I'm not the biggest fan of that style of authorial voice that's constantly making snarky, silly asides. It always feels like it's trying a little too hard to get the reader on side, and it seems to be a very common feature of books written for children. It's not a bad technique by any means, it's just something that doesn't land for me personally, and humour is a very personal thing. I will say that this is doing a decent job of evoking the tone of Choose Your Own Adventure books and then marrying it to more adult themes of violence and revolution, and you end up with something that feels like it was designed to radicalise 9-year-olds, and to me that seems like a fairly worthwhile thing. If I was going to be critical of the design, I'd also say that it's simple to a fault. This is a series of linear paths that have very little to do with each other and tend to blossom out into a set of endings at their termination. There's plenty of forks in the path, but there aren't any ways to rejoin a narrative later once you've forked off, so to speak. And the self-contained nature of the different options does feel a little limiting because there's nothing to discover in terms of structure. I found a lot of the narratives you could get had a very, very similar rhythm to them. And it makes hunting for the different endings feel a little bit mechanical. There's definitely times when I felt a strong sense of when an ending was likely to turn up because of that repetitive quality to the structure. So I think it would have benefited from some more surprises and more experimentation in terms of how it was laid out. It's not a big criticism, but it is something I did spot. Also, while I'm whinging, I resent the notion that the middle classes don't know how to party. Margaret Killjoy has clearly never been outside in all bar one at chucking out time. Also, on very minor quibbles, I would have liked a little bit more art. None of these issues fundamentally broke my enjoyment of What Lies Beneath the Clock Tower. I had a very nice time with it, and it's extremely cheap for a decent chunk of content. You can get it on Amazon, and I assume other platforms as well. In some ways, I think my favourite elements are some of the things thrown out in passing, like the cages in the Gnome City which house prisoners who only get fed if they sing for their supper, and that is a wonderful, grotesque image. It's perhaps a relatively minor entrant in the gamebook canon, but I got to foment a revolution by many and diverse means, and that's a lot of fun. It's also very pleasant to see at least some of my own ideological convictions reflected in a gamebook, and in a way that recognises some of the complexities inherent in holding those views. That's something that doesn't happen very often, and I appreciate it. That's all for this episode. Join me in a couple of weeks when I'll be playing the third sorcery book, which I am hugely looking forward to, since I don't think I ever played it when I was a kid. Don't forget, I've also got a second podcast where I review terrible, cheap movies made by the Asylum and talk myself into enjoying most of them because I have something wrong with me. Recent episodes include mockbusters of Star Wars and RoboCop, so there's plenty of fun there for the whole family. You can get in touch with me by emailing me at hjdoomretrofun, all one word, at gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky at hjdoom. Thank you very much for listening. Take care, and I'll see you soon.